The president invoked infestation to criticize lawmakers before. You see a pattern here? Crime-infested places from which they came. Rat and rodent-infested mess. Ebola-infested areas of Africa. Sanctuary areas want out of this ridiculous crime-infested and breeding concept. Cummings District is a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess.
Today, we're going to be talking about Trump's opinion on people of color, considering the fact that Trump said a bunch of awful things, awful racist things about his attacks on Baltimore Congressperson Elijah Cummings and the 700,000 residents of Maryland's 7th District. He called it a rat and rodent-infested mess. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at Trump's statements. Now, since then, Trump also turned around and called Al Sharpton some names as well. Let's take a look really quickly. Okay. Trump says, I've known Al for 25 years, went to fights with him and Don King, always got along well. He loved Trump. He would ask me for favors often. Al's a con man, a troublemaker, always looking for a score, just doing his thing. Must have intimidated Comcast NBC, hates whites and cops. Now, Trump called Al Sharpton a con man, which I don't necessarily disagree with. And it's kind of funny since Trump is also a con man. But he then followed that up by saying he hates whites and cops, which is absolutely racial agitation. Here's a photo of Al Sharpton and Trump together. Takes one to know one as far as con men go, of course. But what's really interesting here is that this is happening a week after Trump told 4 black and brown American congresswomen to go back to their countries, and he was running his playbook of racial agitation to get media coverage. But, of course, according to his supporters, he is not a racist, even though this is the same guy who claimed Maxine Waters was low IQ, who said John Lewis was all talk, that black countries were shitholes, black athletes were sons of bitches, and our black president was likely a Kenyan, and that black and brown kids falsely implicated in the Central Park rape case needed to be executed. Not a racist, by the way. But what frustrates me about this issue, aside from the obvious racism, is how quickly conservative media jumped on the claim that Bernie Sanders had said similar things about Baltimore, and that he could not have been a racist because of that. I mean, this absolves Trump of any sort of racism because Bernie Sanders blasted Baltimore as a third world country as well. As a matter of fact, right after the Fox News coverage on this, Trump, of course, also tweeted it out because Trump parallels everything you hear on Fox News. Here's Trump's statement of defense. Crazy Bernie Sanders recently equated the city of Baltimore to a third world country. Based on that statement, I assume that Bernie must now be labeled a racist, just as a Republican would if he used that term in standard. The fact is, Baltimore can be brought back, maybe even to new heights of success and glory, but not with King Elijah and that crew. When the leaders of Baltimore want to see the city rise again, I am in a very beautiful oval-shaped office waiting for your call. Now, before I talk about the difference between Bernie's statements and Trump's statements and what that means, I just want to show you the Bernie statement from Baltimore, just so you can get a better understanding, that you can get a better picture of what Bernie Sanders said. So this is in December 2015 when Bernie's visiting West Baltimore to talk about poverty and disrepair there, and a reporter after the press conference asked about ISIS. Here are Bernie Sanders' remarks.
All right, what about ISIS, guys? How often are these people talking about the issues that we talked about today? Of course I'll talk about ISIS. But today what we're talking about is a community in which half of the people don't have jobs. We're talking about a community in which there are hundreds of buildings that are uninhabitable. We're talking about a community where kids are unable to go to schools that are decent. You want to ask me about ISIS? We will talk about ISIS. But what I said, and let me repeat, and you can agree with me or not, what I have said is that obviously ISIS and terrorism are a huge national issue that we've got to address. But so is poverty, so is unemployment, so is education, so is healthcare, so is the need to protect working families.
So I want you to understand something, okay? I want you to understand that the media, of course, does not want to talk about things in a nuanced fashion, and that the only time there's nuance is when people are defending their candidates or whoever they perceive to be ideological allies. And you could, of course, say that I'm doing the same thing here, but I'm not. I'm going to explain exactly why in a moment. Now, there are differences between addressing the systemic issues that a community faces and a difference between using those systemic issues as a prop to attack an opponent, which is what Trump did. Now, take the statement, for example, African Americans are uneducated and don't have jobs. If I just left it at that, that could be perceived as racist potentially. And there's absolutely a giant difference between saying that and leaving that statement just as is versus saying African Americans are uneducated and don't have jobs as a consequence of the intergenerational violence they have experienced with slavery, segregation, and the continued systemic disenfranchisement which refuses to allocate the necessary resources to rebuild these communities. There's a difference between using the undesirable outcomes of systemic inequality as a political tool, which Trump most commonly does, versus actually talking about systemic inequality in an effort to solve it. Now, you might call me partisan or Bernie bro or whatever, but I prefer the guy who wants to solve those problems. I prefer the honest guy. That's why I like Bernie Sanders over Trump. Anyway, I'm Hasan Piker, and this has been The Breakdown.